Lyra heard the sound of tearing flesh and braced for pain. But none came. "Are you all right?" A masculine voice. "Julian," it was Julian's voice. Her eyes flew open. She looked up at him. He stared ahead, face set in tight concentration as he ran full tilt through the forest. "Yes," she muttered. "Hold on tight." She swallowed hard and wrapped her arms around his neck. The world-blurred trees whipping past, wind stinging her eyes. He ran at a speed she hadn't thought possible in any human form. But then again, he was the Lycan King, the alpha of alphas. The metallic tang of blood trailed them. Only after a minute did she realize it was his. Her fingers slid below his neck and brushed torn, tender flesh. A claw. "Mark, you're injured," she exclaimed. "I'm fine." He didn't slow, not even a fraction, until they broke through to the edge of the forest where Beryl and a few warriors waited. The moment Beryl spotted her, she sprinted over, worry etched deep. "What happened?" she blurted, eyes searching Lyra for wounds. Julian set Lyra on her feet. When Beryl saw she was whole, she let out a sharp breath and pulled her into a tight hug. "I'm so sorry for leaving you behind." "Why are you apologizing?" Lyra asked. "It was my idea." They pulled back. Beryl glanced around, scanning the tree line. "Where is Victoria?" Lyra turned to Julian. "Victoria is still out there. I hid her in a cave where the wolf can't reach." "I already had someone get her," he said. "Thank you for saving me," Lyra said softly. "How is your back?" "It's a small injury. Nothing to worry about." "An injury?" Beryl circled to look. Her brow pinched when she saw the jagged slash marks tearing through his skin. "You need to get that checked ASAP." "I'm fine," Julian insisted. A cluster of academy students arrived, faces pale and anxious. The news of the attack had spread quickly, and those scattered in the forest for the practical had been summoned back. Thankfully, it looked like no one else had been hurt or crossed paths with the monster wolf. The trainer who had come with Beryl stepped forward. "Your Majesty, what happened?" "We were attacked by rogues," Julian said. "For now, the forest is off limits until we capture the remaining rogues. Keep the students within the academy during school hours until it's declared safe." "Of course, Your Majesty." Lyra caught his eye, confusion tightening her features. He knew why. The thing out there wasn't a common rogue. It was a corrupted wolf, its power twisted by forbidden methods, far more dangerous. But telling the truth would only spark panic. Better to handle it quietly, trace its origin, and find out if there were others like it nearby. Julian turned away, and the trainer began ushering students back to the school. The wild combat test was cancelled. There would be another when the forest was declared safe again. When Lyra reached her room, worry gnawed at her. Julian had acted like the injury was nothing, but Beryl had insisted he go straight to the Royal Hospital. Alphas healed fast. If Beryl, seasoned healer that she was, had thought it urgent, then it had to be the wolf. That wolf had been anything but normal. What if it had infected him with something? The more she thought about it, the more restless she became. "Why don't you go and visit him?" Ray suggested. "He got hurt saving you, so you should thank him properly, right?" "Right." That was a good excuse to check on him. If he was even still there, maybe it was nothing and he'd already been discharged. She left her room and headed for the hospital building. The corridors were quiet, washed in soft lamplight and the faint scent of antiseptic. She slipped to Julian's room unnoticed and eased the door open, stepping inside. He was asleep. She moved to his bedside and looked down at him. His face was relaxed, no tension, no lines of pain. The blanket covered him to the waist, leaving the bandages crossing his torso visible. He's strong, she thought. He'll heal in no time. Her gaze drifted back to his face. Sleeping, he looked softer, handsome in a way she never let herself acknowledge when he was scowling or giving her that icy look. Her fingers lifted, tempted to trace the sculpted line of his cheekbone. Don't wake him. Don't be stupid. She curled her hand into a fist and let it fall back to her side. She didn't know how long she stood there, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest, listening to the hush of the room when footsteps sounded in the corridor. Panic snapped through her. How could she explain being in the king's private room? She turned to leave. A warm, unyielding hand closed around her wrist. Julian's. Startled. Lyra looked at him. He was awake now, staring at her. Her lips parted soundlessly. He cocked his head. Get in. She blinked. What? Julian glanced at the door. Footsteps drew closer. Get in bed with me, unless you want to be discovered. You won't make it out of here in time. Lyra swallowed hard. He was right. She could leave, but whoever was out there would see her. But to get into his bed. He is almost here, Julian said, arching an eyebrow. Oh well, it wasn't like she hadn't shared a bed with him before, and done much more obscene things. Acting quickly, she climbed onto the bed and lay on his other side. She wriggled downwards so that when he pulled the blanket to his chest, she was completely covered. It was warm and smelled like him. And medicine. She held as still as she could. A few seconds later, the door opened. Heavy footsteps came toward the bed. You are up. Asher's voice reached her. Lyra exhaled in relief. Better that it was Asher and not a nurse. Even if she slipped and he realized she was there, well, he knew all about her and Julian. Julian grunted. I'll be out of here in no time. I doubt a rogue would have put you on your back, Asher said. What really happened out there? There was a brief silence before Julian revealed. It was a corrupted wolf. Lyra bit her lip. Just as she had thought, Julian could have handled a rogue easily. And just as she feared, the injury from a corrupted wolf posed a real danger. What? Asher exclaimed. A corrupted wolf. How is that possible? We eradicated them a long time ago. Clearly, not as thoroughly as we thought, Julian said, somber. Corrupted wolves were a danger not just to the werewolf community but to humans as well, a product of forbidden experiments designed to hunt and nothing else. No conscience-efficient war machines. When they had appeared, they'd wreaked havoc among packs, slaughtering many werewolves. The royal warriors had hunted them down and eradicated them from the region. At least, that's what everyone had thought. Given the threat they posed, their reappearance was enough to make pack leaders around the kingdom lose confidence in the crown and ask Julian to step down as the Lycan king. Asher sighed heavily. We'll have to deal with it as quickly as possible. Those packs that have been challenging you because you don't have a queen will have an even better excuse to encourage others to rise up against you. You're right. Julian cut himself off with a groan. Hidden under the blankets, Lyra froze. She had shifted and accidentally brushed his groin. Are you in pain? Asher asked, worried. He stepped closer to the bed. Do you need help? No. Julian snapped, halting him. Number, I'm fine. We'll discuss how to go about this later. You can leave now. Asher hesitated. Are you sure you're okay? I can get a nurse. I'm all right. Julian answered with finality. All right, Asher said. I'll take my leave. Julian nodded. Footsteps retreated. The door opened and closed. Lyra exhaled heavily. Julian threw back the blanket, uncovering her. He's gone, he told her, his honey-colored eyes full of mirth. She looked away, embarrassed. Sorry, I didn't mean to do that. It was an accident. I'll go now. Sorry for disturbing you. She tried to climb out of the bed, but Julian wrapped his arm around her middle and kept her pressed against him. What's the hurry? I didn't say you could leave. Besides, shouldn't you fix the problem you've caused? She blinked at him. Problem. Julian took her hand and pressed it to his groin. His arousal was straining against the lightweight hospital trousers. Lyra swallowed. She licked her lips nervously. "I'm sorry. I don't want you to be sorry," he told her. "I want you to take care of it." Heat washed through her mortification, tangled with a sharp pulse of desire. "Sorry, He caught her with a hand around her neck, drew her back to him, and shut her up with a kiss. Lyra floated out of the hospital, giddy one breath away from giggles. Warmth bloomed under her palms as she cupped her flushed cheeks. Lost on cloud 9, she didn't notice Zero until he called her name. She dropped her hands at once and schooled her face. Zero closed the distance and stopped in front of her. His gaze cool and assessing. "Lyra," he said, "it's been a while." It had. The last time she'd seen him was the day he'd pretended to kiss her in class. She'd since learned he'd been confined by the king's orders. And she knew it was because of her. "Hi," she replied. "I'm sorry about what happened the other day. The king shouldn't have taken it out on you." Zero shook his head, a faint frown creasing his brow. "I don't care what he does to me, as long as he doesn't make you suffer." He stepped closer. "You know you can rely on me, right?" Lyra was grateful. He'd stood up for her. But she didn't want him doing it at his own expense, and she didn't want him standing between her and Julian. That only made everything harder. "I want you to stop," she said, meeting his eyes. "You know Julian is my mate, right?" Zero's jaw ticked. He stayed silent, then nodded once. A truth he wished he could change, and couldn't. "It's best if you stop doing anything for me," she said. "It's not good for either of us." Trouble flickered across his face. "How can I do nothing? I've seen how he treats you. You're his mate, but he doesn't treasure you. I can't just watch and do nothing." "You can," she said steady and firm, "because it has nothing to do with you. I'm not your mate, Alpha Zero. What happens between me and Julian is none of your business. It's not your job to watch over me or interfere in my personal life." Zero shook his head, thrown by her tone. Before, when she'd warned him off, he could tell it was because she was worried about him. He'd seen gratitude, admiration in her eyes. Now there was steel, almost hostility, as if he were nothing but a nuisance. "Did he threaten you?" he asked. The only explanation he could stomach for this sudden shift. "You don't have to be afraid of him." "No," she cut in firm. "He's actually been very nice to me lately. Things are good between us, and I don't want you to ruin it." "Is he going to let everyone know you're his mate?" Zero asked. Lyra hesitated. That was a good question, if it even counted as one. Even if Julian had sent Crystal out of the palace, they were still engaged. He'd been kinder lately, but whether he wanted people to know Lyra was his mate, that was another matter. "He won't, and you know it," Zero said when she stayed silent. "He's too proud to admit a lowly Omega is his mate. He thinks you're too weak to be queen. If he can't accept you on those terms, how can he be your mate? Will he keep you by his side while he marries another she-wolf and makes her his queen and official mate?" "Is that what you think of me?" Lyra asked, hurt flaring. "That I'm weak and lowly?" "No," Zero said at once. "I think you're brave and amazing. I don't care about your status or background. If you accepted me, I'd go against anything and anyone to be with you. You're more important to me than anything else. If you met your mate, you'd forget me in a heartbeat," she said, bitterness slipping in. She didn't doubt his sincerity, but the mate bond eclipsed everything. "So maybe you shouldn't be here, telling me to abandon my own mate." "I don't believe I would," Zero said quietly. "Hasn't Julian already shown it's possible to shun one's mate? If the bond is so powerful, why isn't it enough to make him accept you fully? It hasn't stopped him from searching for a queen among others, has it?" Lyra hated how right he sounded. He didn't know it, but he was cracking the small hopes that had begun to bloom inside her. She almost hated him for that. Do not forget, he is the one person who has treated you with respect and kindness since you came to the palace, Ray murmured, sensing Lyra's souring mood. Don't be so harsh on him. Am I required to pay for his kindness by choosing him then? Lyra snapped back in her head. Chill, Ray said. I'm just saying he's not your enemy. Don't get so defensive. Look, I know the sex with Julian is very good, but remember, before he dazzled you in bed, you thought Zero was your dream mate. Annoyed, Lyra slammed the connection shut. How dare Ray imply she was basing her feelings on sex? It wasn't about that. Julian had genuinely been kind, and she didn't want to do anything that would make him go back to hostility. But Ray was right about one thing. Zero wasn't the enemy. He wanted the best for her. Still, she needed him to stop meddling. After everything he'd done, he didn't deserve cruelty. But he needed to understand there was no chance. I'm really grateful for everything you've done for me, she said softly. But I have no feelings for you. Whether Julian accepts me or not, the fact remains I don't love you. And I never will. If you keep trying like this, it'll only hurt us both. Hurt flashed in Zero's eyes, dimming the light there. She tried not to be harsh. But what could cut deeper than telling him she could never return his feelings? I'm really sorry, she added. He looked as if she'd dumped a bucket of cold water over him. It hurt to see. I'll see you around. He didn't stop her as she walked past. She took that as a good sign. Maybe this time he'd accept her rejection. The next day in class, Lyra was relieved to see Victoria not only recovered, but also keeping her distance. She pushed thoughts of Zero aside and focused on her lessons. She had catching up to do, but she performed well better than she'd expected. Determined as she'd always been, she wasn't blind to her limits. Yet with each class, she proved she was capable of far more than she dared dream. Confidence bloomed, making her hungrier to learn. A week later, the class held an assessment paired one-on-one combat practice. Lyra drew Beryl. Even though Lyra had shown surprising skill for an Omega, everyone expected Beryl to win. To their surprise, Lyra blocked most of Beryl's attacks and landed sharp counters of her own. You're really good, Beryl said afterward, awe bright in her eyes. How are you so quick on your feet? You had me dizzy for a moment there. I've never seen Beryl lose so badly, a classmate blurted. That was unexpected. You proved everyone wrong, someone else added. Congrats. More voices chimed in with congratulations. It was the first time so many of them had openly admired her. As for her speed, well, maybe that had something to do with her mental control. Lyra hadn't expected much, given her rank, but she'd found she could slow Beryl's reflexes just fine. Such powerful mental control was unheard of in an Omega. While her performance across classes showed she was far beyond the usual Omega skill set, her mental control baffled her most. Knowing it was out of the ordinary, she kept quiet, better not to raise suspicions or speculation. When she herself didn't understand the source of her strength, her classmates were still peppering her with questions about strategy and technique when Julian strode into the training arena. The room's energy shifted, and Lyra's heart leaped before she could stop it. As soon as she saw Julian, Beryl broke away from the crowd of students and approached him. What's going on there? Julian asked, studying the group around Lyra. His first worry had been that they were ganging up on her. But the looks on their faces and Lyra suggested otherwise. Lyra just beat my ass in one-on-one combat, Beryl told him. Everyone's surprised. Julian frowned. Really? Did you let her win? Hell no, Beryl said. I know how serious she is about this, and she'd hate me if I pulled something like that. I kid you not, she beat me fair and square. Ask the teacher. Ask anyone here. I definitely wasn't pulling my punches. That's impossible, Julian said. She's just an Omega, Beryl shrugged. An Omega who's proven she can keep up with elites from all over the kingdom. Don't underestimate her. Your Majesty. The class instructor Frank approached with a respectful bow. It's an honor to have you inspect the class in person. We were just getting started. Is it true, what I'm hearing about Miss Jenkins? Julian asked. What's your assessment of her performance? Miss Jenkins has surpassed my expectations, Frank reported. I expected I might need to make allowances for her rank, but throughout my classes she's kept pace with her peers. Her opponent for this test was Miss Beaverbarrel, and despite the difference in their rank, Miss Jenkins won. Julian's eyes moved to Lyra. She was watching him. As soon as their eyes met, she looked away, pretending to be focused on something else. That's interesting, he murmured. It is interesting, Beryl agreed. Now that I think of it, maybe we don't know the true strength of Omegas, because they've never been allowed to join training programs. If Lyra's case is anything to go by, others like her might have untapped potential. Maybe it's time we changed how things run around here. Julian lifted an eyebrow. What are you suggesting? Lyra beating higher-ranked werewolves could encourage Omegas to train and build their strength, Beryl said. Many Omegas think they're incapable, and our laws haven't helped prove otherwise. Wouldn't it be good to let every Omega unearth their hidden potential? It would strengthen our packs and the kingdom. Thinking it over, Julian had to admit she was right. Omegas, as the lowest rank, were never expected to do much. They weren't as physically powerful as the others, so they were shut out from important sectors across the kingdom. They existed to serve. They weren't allowed to pursue the same interests as other ranks. It had been that way from the start, which meant they'd never had a real chance to fit anywhere else. Lyra joining the royal training camp had been a fluke, but it was turning out to be an eye-opener. What if more Omegas joined such programs? Could more of them stand against higher ranks? As Lycan King, he couldn't ignore that possibility. It could make the kingdom stronger. You're right, he told Beryl. We cannot sit on such potential. He turned to the palace official who had followed him to the arena. Publish a royal decree. All packs must allow Omegas to join their training programs, effective immediately. A ripple of shock moved through the students, a low murmur rising and falling. Lyra could barely believe her ears. A royal decree was final mandatory. Any alpha who disobeyed would face the Lycan King himself. With a few words, Julian had changed a huge part of Omegas' lives. Yes, Your Majesty, the palace official said, jotting on her tablet. Julian's eyes found Lyra again. This time, she didn't look away. Awe held her in place, too breathless to be self-conscious. Also, he said, voice carrying over the arena, I'm establishing a scholarship in Lyra Jenkins's name to support Omegas who wish to pursue extensive training. And note this, I'm abolishing any and all laws that forbid Omegas from attending schools anywhere in the kingdom. Yes, Your Majesty, the official replied again. Lyra wasn't sure she was still breathing. A scholarship in her name. She hadn't imagined anything like that. But even that wasn't what stole her breath. It was what it meant for other Omegas. Most of them couldn't afford school, even if they were allowed to attend. A scholarship meant poverty wouldn't bar them from learning like everyone else. And abolishing the laws that kept Omegas out of school, it felt too good to be true. But Julian was the Lycan King, and he'd decreed it. So, it would be. She felt like she was dreaming. Beryl appeared in front of her and took her hands. Are you crying? She asked, a big smile lighting her face. Lyra blinked. What? A breathless laugh escaped her. Am I? Maybe she was. Joy flooded her so hard it felt like an out-of-body experience. Looks like you're about to, Beryl said. Congratulations, you've changed history all by yourself. Lyra shook her head. No, that was you. Thank you for suggesting that to the king. I can't believe he agreed. He did. And only because you proved Omegas are capable of more than we ever imagined. Be proud of yourself. It was hard to accept that she was the reason for such an enormous change. She would be eternally grateful to Beryl. And to Julian. Maybe he wasn't as bad as he'd seemed at first. If he truly despised Omegas, he would never have made laws in their favor. Yay! Ray cheered, practically bouncing. I told you, didn't I? I said you would change everything, and here you are doing it. Do you believe me now? For once, Lyra had no argument for Ray's over-enthusiasm. This did feel like everything. There was a lot of prejudice and discrimination against Omegas. That wouldn't vanish overnight. In fact, the king's new laws might stir more animosity from ranks who believed Omegas didn't deserve the same things they did. But even so, Lyra knew the laws could change everything. They were the first step in the right direction, and with time, they could become the norm. A little, she teased Ray. Back in the Red Moon Pack, Alpha Devon received the king's decree with a deep sneer. As if the orders weren't ridiculous enough, they somehow involved Lyra Jenkins. How could a spineless, weak, worthless Omega make the Lycan King change pack laws? He hadn't expected her to survive in the palace. Not only had she survived, she was doing well enough to influence the king. The king. The little witch, he spat, pacing, the new document crumpled in his fist. She must be in his bed, whispering poison in his ear. I never thought the mighty Lycan King would let himself be led by a common parasite. The thought sparked a new worry. What else might she be telling him? Yes, he'd threatened her with her parents' belongings. But if the king believed her and decided to punish Devon, what then? Since the king hadn't moved against him, Devon chose to assume Lyra had kept quiet. If she had, then he still had time to turn things around for his pack. His pack no longer enjoyed a close relationship with the palace. But Lyra was close to the king, and he could use her to regain the Lycan King's favor. He only had to play his cards. Right. Lyra had just woken up when a soft knock tapped at her door. She padded over and opened it. On the other side stood a maid with a tray piled high with breakfast. Tracy, Lyra asked, confused. Good morning, Lyra, Tracy chirped. Here's your breakfast. Can I put it inside? Lyra blinked and stepped aside. Sure, Tracy smiled and breezed past her. Lyra shut the door and followed. This had become the new norm, maids bringing breakfast right to her room. You don't have to do this, Lyra told her, as she'd told the others a dozen times. Ever since everyone had learned, she was the reason the king changed the laws for Omegas. The palace staff had treated her like their personal hero, almost like royalty. I don't mind, Tracy said, arranging the dishes neatly on Lyra's small table. You need to get to school on time, so you can't waste time going to the dining room. Can I draw your bath while you eat? No. Lyra shook her head. I'll just take a shower. No time for a bath in the morning. Of course, silly me. Anything else I can do for you? No, thanks. And thank you for the breakfast. This is the least I can do, Tracy said softly. You've changed our lives. My little siblings are thrilled to go to school now. They wake Mom up at dawn trying to get ready hours early. I'm really grateful for what you did. It's all thanks to the king's grace, not me, Lyra said. But I'm happy to hear your siblings love school. Yes, it's the king's order, but it wouldn't have happened without you. You're our hero. Tracy's eyes shone with open admiration. I won't bother you any longer. Have a good day at school, Lyra nodded. Thanks, you too. After Tracy left, Lyra picked up her fresh mug of coffee and moved to the window. The morning was bright and warm. Everything felt surreal. She wasn't used to this. She'd expected the attention to fade after a few days. But it had been weeks. Not only was her social life going well, but school and Julian were too. If she could even call it a relationship, he hadn't picked a fight with her in weeks, and when they were together he was gentle, steady. Since before her pack had been wiped out, nothing in her life had felt this stable. After breakfast and a quick shower, she headed out. A few classmates fell into step beside her, chatting easily. It was a sharp contrast to the days she'd walked alone, or when only a handful of students dared speak to her. That evening, after her last class, she went to the teacher's lounge to deliver a due assignment. Her hand was on the handle when she spotted Julian inside. She froze, then took a step back. It had been more than a week since they'd last been together. Anxiety fluttered in her chest. Could she ask him to hang out? He was her mate, but he was also the Lichen King. She missed him. God, she missed him. But she couldn't just walk in and say that, could she? What are you overthinking? Ray murmured at her shoulder. Seduce him. Shut up, Lyra grumbled. No. Seriously, Ray said. We both know he can't resist you. Lyra worried her bottom lip. I don't want him to think that you want to have sex with your mate. Ray cut in. Yay, that's unheard of. You are not helping, Lyra hissed. Are you going to pretend you don't lie in bed every night, wishing he'd show up at your door? Ray asked. I didn't say I don't, Lyra muttered. Then, stop being a coward. Get in there and work your magic, Lyra snorted. What magic? Didn't he say you had a magic effect on him last time? Ray. What? Ray blinked innocently. Lyra facepalmed. Just shut up. Let me think. Before she could, Beryl's voice drifted from inside the lounge. So, are you really going ahead with the engagement party? Yes, Julian replied. Lyra frowned. Engagement party. I thought you'd ditch her after you chased her from the palace, Beryl said. Do you really want to marry Crystal Black? I don't think she's your type. What do you know about my type? Julian shot back. Lyra doesn't know about it yet. Does she? Beryl pressed. Silence stretched for several beats. Then Julian's voice clipped and annoyed. Do you have the information I asked for or not? I didn't come here for pointless gossip. Lyra's heart dropped to her stomach. She hadn't heard a word about any engagement party, so he was still going ahead with it, and here she was, acting like a lovesick fool. Forgetting the assignment, she turned and slipped away. Outside the building, she ran into Victoria. Since the incident in the forest, things had been cordial between them. Not friends, but not rivals either. So Lyra was surprised when Victoria stopped her. Hey, Lyra, can I have a word? Lyra tucked her heartbreak away and nodded. Yeah, sure. Victoria clasped her hands in front of her chest. I want to say thank you for saving my life that day. I don't think I ever properly thanked you. I owe you. No problem, Lyra said gently. I'm glad you're okay. Since you saved my life, you have my pack's support if you ever need it, Victoria told her. Lyra shook her head. That's not really necessary. It is, Victoria insisted. What better way could I repay you? Lyra couldn't imagine a situation where she'd need a pack's support. Then again, her life loved a twist. Maybe one day she'd be thrown out of the palace and need a new place to call home. All right, thank you, she said. I appreciate it. Back in her room, she lay on the bed, sinking into the mattress. She didn't understand Julian. She'd been stupid to think she knew where they stood. He'd started treating her like his mate. But apparently, it meant nothing. Zero's words came back, sharp as a blade. As long as Julian hid her and didn't claim her as his queen, could she really call herself his mate? Even if things felt right between them, he was still planning to marry Crystal. But he had told her, hadn't he? He'd get a queen, and she would be his mistress. She hadn't thought about those words in so long because it hadn't seemed like that was what he still intended. Lying there, though, she felt that he'd meant every word. No matter how good they were, he didn't think she was fit to stand at his side. Her phone pinged, cutting through the gloom. A message from Beryl reminding her that she, Beryl, and Zero would meet later that evening to discuss the upcoming final test before graduation. The teacher had divided the class into groups of 3. They'd compete for the top prize at the end of the program. Lyra had been excited about the competition and graduation. Right now, she couldn't feel any of that. Only the hollow ache where her hope had been. The final task before graduation, the one Lyra was taking part in alongside Beryl and Zero, was a treasure hunt to retrieve hidden flags. A handful of flags were scattered across the royal forest, each contested by 3 groups. During the event, students were forbidden to shift into their wolf forms. The task was meant to test resilience, teamwork, and stamina. Lyra was determined to get the flag and take first place with her teammates. She wanted to prove Julian and anyone else who shared his way of thinking wrong. She was not useless. She had already gone up against the kingdom's elites and held her own. He could choose the bluest blood to be his queen, but she would not let his treatment bury her. She was capable. She was strong. She didn't belong in the shadows. She could shine just fine. She would show him. "What's that look on your face?" Beryl asked, sliding in at her side. "Trying to scare our opponents before we even begin." Lyra glanced at her and cracked a smile. She hadn't realized her inner turmoil was written all over her face. "You mean they're not scared yet?" "They are," Zero said, joining them. He tilted his head toward one of the other teams. "I just heard them strategizing how to hold you back." "They're worried about me?" Lyra asked, disbelieving. "Of course," Zero said. "Everybody knows you're the ace of our team. Beryl and I will do our best not to slow you down. We'll keep an eye out for anyone trying to get in your way. You're our best hope." "Flatterer," Lyra mumbled. At first things had been awkward after she rejected him, but over the weeks that air had cleared, Zero no longer involved himself in her affairs, yet they remained cordial. Suddenly, Zero dropped to one knee. Lyra looked down to find him tying her shoelace. A few students noticed and started whispering, their smiles mischievous. Heat crept into Lyra's cheeks. She knew exactly what they were saying. "Done." Zero stood and flashed a disarming smile. "First, we make sure you don't take yourself out." Beryl patted him on the back. "Ever the gentleman, how come Julian is the complete opposite when you two grew up together?" "I'm not a gentleman," Zero said. He met Lyra's eyes for a heartbeat, then looked away. "Thank you," Lyra said, wondering at the look she'd caught there. Beryl was right. Zero was a gentleman. Yet his denial didn't feel like simple humility. It felt like something else, something he wouldn't name. Beryl bobbed her head. "Right. And I'm not female." Maps were handed out. Their flag lay in the western part of the forest, and Lyra recognized the terrain at a glance. "I know a shortcut," she told Beryl and Zero. Zero raised a brow. "What do you mean? You've never been there." "I have," she said. "I train in the forest after school sometimes." "What?" His voice turned horrified. "The forest has been closed for weeks due to safety concerns. Have you been going in there alone?" "Before the incident," she said. Not entirely true. Yes, she'd gone back a few times since the corrupted wolf attack, but only because, even with the warning in place, she knew from Julian that the patrols hadn't found traces of foreign wolves. "Even then," Zero said, "you never know what you'll come across in there. It's better to go in pairs." "I'll keep that in mind," she said. His concern rang clear in his voice and showed on his face. Even after she'd turned him down, he still worried for her. Genuinely, she no longer fantasized about being his mate, but she couldn't help thinking his true mate would be lucky to have him by her side. They worked out their route and strategy, plotting how to reach the treasure first, and how to counter the other teams. The trickiest part wasn't getting to the flag, it was getting back to base with it. Opponents were allowed to dispossess each other at any point, and the winner was the one who brought the flag home. Getting there first didn't guarantee anything. Once the event began, the three of them split up. It was their trick, make it harder for opponents to disrupt their progress. Lyra would go straight to the treasure using her shortcut, while Zero and Beryl threw everyone off her trail. It helped that Lyra's scent wasn't as strong as theirs. Even in human form, their scent still carried. Hers faded faster. Harder to track. They took different paths, but eventually they converged on a common point. Beryl and Zero arrived just in time to see Lyra streaking toward them at full speed, a red flag clenched in one hand. Her clothes were smudged with dirt and leaves, and a bruise was already blooming on her forehead. "What happened?" Beryl asked as Lyra reached them. "Are you okay?" "I'm good," Lyra said between heavy breaths. "Anna, from Team B, got there at the same time we fought for it. I won. But she's right behind me." "Good job," Zero said. "Let's move, we're not giving this up." The way back was tougher than the way in. Once the other teams realized the flag had been captured, they set out with one goal: hunt them down. This time, the trio stuck together to better defend the prize. A couple 100 meters from base, two enemies cornered them. "Go!" Zero told Lyra, stepping in front of her. "We'll keep them busy." Beryl gave Lyra a firm nod. "We've got this." Lyra nodded back and tore toward the forest's edge. The two enemies tried to chase Zero, and Beryl cut them off. By the time Lyra disappeared from sight, the clash had turned merciless. When she burst into the base, breath burning and legs aching, she learned they were the first to bring a flag home. It was a couple of hours more before the last winning team staggered in, flag in hand, looking like they'd survived 100 battles. During the graduation ceremony, Lyra was named MVP of the final test and commended for outstanding performance throughout the training period. As was customary, the top graduate was assigned to the King's Guard. It was a position she'd never thought possible for her, something that would have seemed unattainable for a she-wolf of her rank. It was an achievement worth celebrating. But it wasn't all roses and rainbows. After her appointment, the captain of the King's Guard informed her she'd be part of the team accompanying the king to the Blacksword Pack to bring Crystal Black to the palace for the engagement ceremony. With so many members in the guard, and her so new, Lyra assumed she wouldn't be stationed close to the king. She was wrong. To her horror, she was assigned to ride in the same car as Julian, and not up front with the driver. That was how she found herself sitting across from him, forcing herself to numb the ache, as the car ate up the miles to the Blacksword Pack. Closer to the female her mate had chosen over her. Closer to the moment she'd have to watch him belong to someone else. Lyra kept her eyes glued to the window, watching the world smear by through the tinted glass. She could feel Julian's gaze on her more than once. But she fought the urge to look back. The air in the car was heavy with tension. No one spoke. Fine by her, he'd said what he wanted. He was doing exactly that. She wasn't about to be pathetic and say anything. She was here as a member of the King's Guard, not as his mate. She wished she could feel that clean divide. Instead, it felt like being dragged to hell. It was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, landing a job she'd never imagined possible, even in her wildest dreams. She wanted to push everything else away and bask in the promise of a new beginning. Instead, here she was, miserable over a male who wasn't worth it. Lyra checked her wristwatch, calculating how much longer they had. Only 5 minutes since the last time. There were still 2 hours to go. How on earth was she going to survive the next 2 hours? She couldn't. Shit! The car swerved and then slammed to a stop. The jolt pitched her sideways, straight into Julian's lap, his arms wrapped around her before she could catch herself. Over the intercom, the driver said there was an obstacle on the road. It would take a few minutes to clear. Lyra scrambled to get off him, but his hold tightened around her waist. He lowered his head, nuzzling the side of her neck, the tip of his nose tracing her skin. What do you think you're doing?" Her voice came out sharp. Her heart hammered, skin tingling, and she hated it. She'd die before letting him see any of it. "What does it look like I'm doing?" he murmured against her, warm breath skimming her throat. One hand slid under her uniform jacket, tugging her shirt free of her pants. "Stop!" she snapped, catching his wrist and shoving it away. He let go, only to catch her chin a heartbeat later. He turned her face to his. "Haven't you missed me?" For the first time that day. She really looked at him. Was he crazy, or did he have memory loss? "We're on our way to fetch your future queen," she said, because apparently he needed the reminder. "And?" He sounded almost bored, thumb stroking her jaw. "What's that got to do with this?" She clenched her teeth. What a psycho. "Let go of me." His gaze dropped from her eyes to her mouth and back. His grip tightened, holding her steady as he pressed his lips to hers. Lyra kept her mouth sealed and braced her hands against his shoulders. When he realized she wasn't letting him in, he pulled back and released her. Lyra shot off his lap and slid into her seat. She leveled him with a glare as she straightened her uniform. Julian lounged back, crossing one leg over the other. "Aren't you going to do anything about it?" "About what?" she snapped, dropping the pretense of professionalism. She wiped her lips with the back of her hand, letting disgust show. His mouth curled into a condescending smirk. "Me going to get my future queen. I figured you'd grab the chance to remind me. You're my mate. Have you finally given up the delusion of becoming my queen?" Her hands curled into fists. She had been stupid foolish. To think she'd started to believe he cared. Now he wasn't just disregarding her, he was mocking her. She wanted to be angry enough not to feel the hurt clawing inside, but the pain won. The car remained motionless. She reached for the handle and pushed the door open. Cool air hit her as she stepped out and shut it behind her. The rest of the convoy had also stopped, engines idling in a line. Without hesitating, she walked to the car behind and opened the back door. Zero sat inside, alone, a tablet in his hands. "I'll join you," she said, climbing in without waiting for an answer. "Sure." He set the tablet aside. "Everything okay?" "Yeah." She buckled in. "The king wants to be alone." Questions flickered in Zero's eyes, but he didn't ask them. Instead, he nodded. "How's the new job?" "Great," she said, though it came out flat. She wanted to vent. God, she did. But she was the one who'd told Zero to stay out of her mess with Julian. She couldn't dump it all on him now. It was her burden to carry. He had warned her, hadn't he? "Hopefully I don't ruin it." She was already letting her personal feelings bleed into her work. Maybe it was only a matter of time. "Why would you say that?" "You've got this," he said. "Don't forget. You beat a bunch of spoiled elite brats with access to the best resources and opportunities." As always, Zero could lift her mood. She gave him a small smile. "Are you saying you're a spoiled elite brat?" "Depends on the situation." He winked, shameless and mischievous. Crystal could barely hide her dislike for Lyra when the convoy from the palace finally reached the Blacksword Pack. As if it weren't enough that a low-rank Omega like Lyra had managed to influence the kingdom's laws, she was now stationed at the king's side as his personal bodyguard. What was the kingdom coming to? At this rate, anyone might start thinking they were equal to alpha bloodlines. It had almost physically hurt when her father put her in charge of establishing the new scholarship under Lyra's name. If only she'd never left the palace. She would have made sure nothing like this happened. It was a good thing she was going back. Lyra's time to shine. And gloat was over, she just didn't know it yet. Despite the dark twist in her chest, Crystal smiled at Lyra after greeting the king. "I've heard about your achievements at the academy. Congratulations." Lyra saw through the fake smile, but she returned it anyway. "Thank you. I learned a lot." Crystal snickered inwardly. The only thing someone like her needed to learn was her place, and Crystal would see to that. That night, Lyra was assigned to stand guard outside the guest room where Julian was staying. The problem was, he wasn't alone. Crystal joined him. Even after everything, Lyra believed they wouldn't spend the night together. He knew she was right outside the door. He'd have to be utterly cruel to do that. Not long after Crystal disappeared inside, loud feminine moans spilled into the hallway. They were only the beginning, a long, relentless sequence that left no doubt what was happening behind the door. Lyra had been betrayed before, countless times. But this landed like a ton of bricks. Devon had never made her believe he'd accept her as his mate, but Julian, he had acted like he cared. He'd made her think he treasured the bond between them. Now he was showing her that the hopes she'd held were nothing but foolish fantasies. Footsteps echoed in the empty corridor. Lyra looked up to see Zero approaching. She prayed he wouldn't hear, but of course he would. His hearing was better than hers. Humiliation. Burned. Zero reached her and stopped, tipping his head toward the exit. Want to get out of here. Want? She needed to. I can't leave my post, she said. You can, he told her. There are plenty of guards outside. No one will miss you. He'll definitely not miss me. All right, she whispered. Zero led Lyra to a pub in the compound, just a 5-minute walk from Alpha Black's mansion. They took a back corner table and ordered drinks. I know my cousin can be tough to deal with sometimes, Zero said as they waited. But you won't have to put up with it forever. He'd noticed her mood had been subdued lately. He knew why. Julian, the news about the formal engagement to Crystal had to sting. Zero had hoped, when Lyra once said Julian was treating her well, that maybe his cousin had finally come to his senses. But when he heard about the ceremony, he kept his mouth shut. He wanted to comfort her, just not cross a line he had no right to cross. What do you mean? She asked, curious but guarded. Quitting wasn't an option. Even if she had to endure the sight of Julian and Crystal every day, she would not give up what she'd worked so hard for. She would not go back to being powerless. The Queen Mother had given her a chance at a new life. She would hold on to it with both hands. If she kept pushing, maybe that was how she'd break free of Julian at last. Your term in the King's Guard lasts only 3 years, Zero told her. After that, you can request an assignment to a different pack. If you perform well, you could be placed as high as an alpha. Lyra blinked, stunned. Really? Zero nodded. There are permanent members of the King's Guard, and then there are those, like you, who serve for a set term. Where you end up depends on your performance during these 3 years. If you keep doing what you're doing, I'm sure you'll land somewhere great. 3 years felt long, but not impossible. A finish line she could see if she squinted. I didn't know that, she muttered. At some point, she'd given up on reviving her old pack. Too much had been ripped away. But now, things were different. She wasn't a slave anymore. She was stronger. If she worked hard for 3 years, she could go back and rebuild. As long as Julian didn't claim her as his mate, which he clearly had no intention of doing, she could walk out of the royal palace when her term ended. He'd have no excuse to keep her. If he even cared to try after so long, she would be free. Their drinks arrived. They raised their glasses, and when they clinked, Zero caught a new light sparking in Lyra's eyes. He admired that spirit of hers. No matter what, she kept hoping, kept fighting. He had no doubt starting now, she'd be the best recruit the King's Guard had seen in years. It eased him, knowing that while he couldn't be by her side the way he wanted, she wasn't helpless. She could fight her own battles, and she would not break. Later, Lyra went back to her post outside Julian and Crystal's room. By the time she returned, the lights were out. Good. No unpleasant sounds to endure. She tried not to picture the two of them. Tried and failed. Was Julian holding Crystal close, whispering soft words? Were they planning their future? Was he telling her she was the one he needed to stand beside him and rule? In the morning, Julian and Crystal emerged from the room together. Breakfast first, then the drive back to the royal palace. When Crystal saw Lyra, her mouth curled in contempt. Lyra met her gaze with a blank, steady look. "Your Majesty, Miss Black, I'll escort you to breakfast," she said. Crystal rolled her eyes and hooked her arm through Julian's. No one said a word as they moved down the hallway. Lyra fell in step behind them. After they ate, she escorted them to their car. This time, Julian rode with Crystal. Lyra was assigned to a different car. Back at the palace, she no longer had to accompany the king, so she headed to the training room. She'd arranged to spar with Zero, and he joined her a few minutes later. She'd sparred with higher-ranked classmates at training camp, but none of them compared to Zero. He moved like the fight belonged to him. She wanted to see how long she could stand against that. "Don't hold back," she warned as they stepped into the ring. "I won't," he said. He didn't. She realized fast he was on another level entirely. His strength, his timing, relentless. But her reflexes kept her in it. She slipped past strikes, rolled under grabs, lasted far longer than she expected. "You are annoyingly fast," Zero said when they finished, breathing hard. "It'd be hard for anyone to pin you down." "Why? Thank you," she said, smiling as she took a sip of water. "Let's do this again. You keep me on my toes." "Definitely." For the first time in days, Lyra felt a flicker of genuine happiness. She had a long way to go, sure, but she wasn't starting from nothing. With a sparring partner like Zero, she would only get better. That night, she fell asleep with a smile, a quiet certainty warming her chest. She was capable of so much more. The next day, Julian and Crystal's engagement ceremony unfolded at the royal palace. Alphas and Lunas from across the kingdom, along with other high-ranking officials, filled the grounds. The affair glittered so brightly that Lyra couldn't imagine how the wedding would outshine it. As part of the security team, Lyra stood stationed outside the banquet hall before the ceremony began in earnest. Guests streamed past her into the palace, and that was how Devon came upon her. Lyra spotted him from a distance. He wasn't alone. Allison hung on his arm. Lyra hoped they wouldn't notice her. Too much to hope for. Devon's gaze had been sweeping the grounds the moment he stepped inside, hunting for her. When he finally saw her, he did a double take. Definitely Lyra, but different. And it wasn't just that she looked more alluring in tight black pants and a leather jacket. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, her features clean and striking. There was a new bearing about her, calm, contained, like she'd been forged into someone else. His eyes lingered on her chest, then her hips, as he strode toward her with purpose. Damn, he'd forgotten that body. Soft, curvy, all the right places. Allison was too busy admiring the marble and gold to realize where Devon was steering her until they stopped in front of Lyra. She blinked, frowning. "Wait, is this?" "Lyra," Devon said, unhooking his arm from Allison and stepping forward. He smiled. "It's nice to see you again." Lyra watched him with a guarded look. Her gaze flicked to Allison, confused and already annoyed, then back to Devon. Keeping her professional FIA, she said, "Alpha Devon, Luna Allison, welcome to the royal palace." She gestured toward the hall. "The banquet hall is right this way." "How long has it been?" Devon continued, undeterred. Lyra bit back a sigh. Could he not take a hint and get lost already? "Feels like forever. You've changed so much." His eyes crawled over her, shameless, lingering on her chest. Allison stepped in and hooked their arms together again. Lyra knew they were bonded. Mates despite that, Devon made no effort to hide the lust in his eyes. It made Lyra's skin crawl. "Babe, let's go inside," Allison said tightly. "You don't want to be seen talking to a palace slave, do you?" Lyra ignored the bite. "The ceremony will be starting soon. It's best if you go inside. We can catch up until then, Devon said. Catch up? Lyra frowned inwardly. In comparison to the last time they spoke, he sounded like someone else wearing his face. If Julian were nearby, Devon putting on a show would make sense. But she was supposed to be the mate who betrayed him. Why act like an old friend? How's life at the palace? He asked. All right, Lyra answered. Beside him, Allison was seething. She saw how her mate looked at the other female, undressing her with his eyes in broad daylight and right in front of her. And Lyra looked like that. Wasn't she supposed to be shoveling coal in a boiler room? I bet you found your way to survive, Allison said sweetly. I heard you were involved with the new laws the king passed. You must be very close to him. Lyra didn't miss the insinuation. She let it slide. The last thing she wanted was to engage them any further. Your hair looks so much better, Devon said. Was it always this glossy? He lifted a hand to touch it. Lyra caught his wrist, twisted it away from her, then gave him a hard shove. What the hell? Allison snapped, stumbling with him. Devon righted himself and shook off Allison again. What the fuck was that? Lyra regarded him calmly. Don't touch me, Devon huffed. His expression slid from lust to anger. He tugged at his tie, a sneer warping his mouth. You think you're a hotshot now, huh? He glanced around. No one close then raised his hand to slap her. Lyra saw it coming, slipped aside, and drove a punch into his jaw. Allison shrieked. Devon growled and lunged, pure temper, zero thought, never imagining she could fight him. It made him easy to take down. Seconds later, he was on the ground with Lyra's knee, pressing his spine and his arm wrenched behind his back. Behave if you don't want to be thrown out of the palace, she warned. Allison stared, eyes bulging, a hand clamped at her throat. You're crazy. How dare you attack an alpha? Do you want to die? Lyra's mouth twitched. What about this? Suggested she was the one courting death. Understood, she asked Devon, giving his arm one last sharp jerk before releasing him. He scrambled to his feet and scanned the corridor. No witnesses. Thank the gods. His face flushed red, pride scorched. How could an Omega like her put him down like that? Allison rushed to him, fussing over his jacket. Are you okay? Did she hurt you? We should report this to the palace immediately. Shut up, Devon snarled, shrugging out of the jacket and shoving it into Allison's hands. Report that an Omega flattened him. Not a chance. He didn't know where she'd found that strength, but she couldn't shift. Could she really stand against a wolf? I'll teach her manners myself. His eyes flashed red. Lyra's jaw tightened. The last thing she wanted was a spectacle at the king's engagement ceremony. He should think twice, but the feral look in his eyes said he was past reason. She couldn't see a clean way to stop him without getting herself into trouble. When, fortunately, Zero appeared at that very moment. As soon as Zero saw Devon, he recognized him as the alpha of the Red Moon Pack and Lyra's former mate. He moved to Lyra's side, posture squared, gaze hard as granite. What do you think you're doing? Devon's glare snapped up to meet his. What's it to you? This is between me and her. Mind your own business. You're the one who needs manners, and to mind your business. Zero didn't blink. Respect the king's guard, or you'll enjoy the ceremony from the dungeons. The king's what? Devon's eyes flicked from Zero to Lyra and back again, disbelief tightening his jaw. I've no issue with you, he said at last. He jabbed a finger at Lyra. This female is from my pack. She insulted me. It's within my rights to discipline her as I see fit. Zero took a slow step closer to Devon, eyes narrowing. Oh, you have the right to discipline the king's personal bodyguard. You must be very important. Forgive me for not realizing. Devon scoffed. Are you saying she's the king's bodyguard? You've got hearing problems? Is that what she told you? Devon sneered. Or are you lying to cover for her because you've been fucking her? This female is a cursed slave. The last place she'd be is by the king's side. Look, maybe you don't know who she really is. He lifted a hand, aiming to clap Zero on the shoulder. Let me tell you the truth. Zero caught his wrist and snapped it back. He let go just before the bone gave, then allowed his aura to burst forth, rank rolling off him in a crushing wave. I am Alpha Zero of the Azure Pack, and the King's cousin. I'll not warn you twice. Disrespect the King's guard again, and you'll no longer be treated like a guest. Realizing the gravity of Devon's mistake, Allison stepped in quickly and gripped his arm. We're sorry. It was a misunderstanding, she said to Zero. We didn't mean to cause trouble. The Red Moon Pack was already in trouble. The last thing they needed was to provoke a member of the royal family. If Lyra truly served as the king's guard, their aggression toward her could be taken as an affront to the Lycan King himself. Devon's nostrils flared as he wrestled for control. Damn it. What was it with Lyra and all these royal assholes? With a grudging swallow, he let Allison pull him toward the banquet hall. Fine, he'd try again later. About half an hour later, the last guests arrived, and the ceremony was ready to begin. With everyone settled in the banquet hall, it was time for the king and his fiancée to make their entrance. Lyra followed behind them, her gaze fixed on their joined hands. They shared a smile, then stepped into the hall to a swell of applause. It looked like something out of a fairy tale. Lights, silk, admiration humming in the air. What a beautiful couple. Miss Black is very beautiful indeed. Finally, His Majesty found his match. This is a match made by the goddess herself. The kingdom is blessed indeed. Each word landed like a small blade in Lyra's chest. They sounded like proof of Julian's reasoning. He needed a queen with pedigree, power, strength. Crystal Black was all of that. No matter how strong or capable Lyra was, no one would say those things with her at his side. They'd call the king misguided. They'd say the kingdom was doomed. No one would whisper it was the goddess's match, even if, ironically, it was. The hall glittered glitz and glamour from the draped garlands to the guests' jewels. Julian and Crystal took their seats at the high table, a vantage point over the entire hall. Lyra stood behind them, to Julian's right, able to watch every inch of the room. The engagement ceremony began with blessings from the high priestess. Then the royal pack and the Blacksword pack signed a memorandum, officially naming Crystal as the future queen. The document elevated her status and allowed her to act as part of the royal family. From the crowd, Devon watched Lyra like a hawk. How in hell had she reached a place like that? Months ago, she'd been a nobody in his pack. She'd belonged to him. How could she have climbed so high, so fast? He couldn't get that close to the Lycan King without an appointment. Yet there she was, an Omega fixed at the king's shoulder. A slave, a fucking slave above him. She must think highly of herself. He couldn't stand it. One way or another, he'd put her back where she belonged. When the formalities ended, the host announced the start of the festivities, inviting everyone to dance and feast to their fill. As Julian and Crystal moved through the room, greeting guests, Lyra slipped into the shadows at the edge of the hall. Devon took his time winding his way toward her. Many were already half drunk, less likely to notice or care. He stopped in front of Lyra and offered a hand. Would you like to dance with me? Lyra's face stayed blank. This isn't the place for your games, she warned. Stay away from me, unless you want trouble. Devon scoffed and stepped in close, breath warm with wine. Is that so? Have you forgotten what I'm still holding? Her jaw tightened. The box. The only thing left from her parents. As long as Devon held it, she couldn't risk provoking him. There was a time she'd believed Julian would help her get it back. But that time was gone. "That's a yes then," Devon said, a thin, ugly smile cutting across his face. With no choice, Lyra set her hand in his. He smirked and drew her against him, an arm wrapping her waist. "Good, now we can have a nice talk." "I can't dance for long," Lyra said, stomach turning at his touch. "I'm still on duty. I'll be brief then." His hand slid beneath her jacket, pressing at her side through her shirt. "Seems you've made something of yourself at the palace, which means you can be useful to your pack." "I'm no longer part of your pack," Lyra said evenly. "Do you want your inheritance or not?" He growled. "What do you want from me?" she asked, voice tight. Devon's smile didn't reach his eyes. "One of my major investments didn't pan out, and our pack's finances are tight. You can help me with that, right?" "I'm not sure I can help you with that," Lyra told him. "What do you mean you can't?" Devon asked. "Surely they don't pay the king's bodyguards skimpily, do they?" Lyra stared at him for a few seconds, speechless. He wanted her to give him her money, the money she earned. How was she supposed to fix his pack's finances with her salary? "It's not like she was getting paid an insane amount. I don't think I can be any help to you with my salary," she said. "Oh, come on." He lifted a hand to stroke her cheek. Lyra knocked it away immediately. He snickered, then leaned in, breath hot against her ear. "You've made important friends in the palace. I'm sure you can find a way to give me what I want. If you can't, you know what will happen to your belongings." Ha! Lyra refused to think about what he meant. Either way, she couldn't let him destroy the box. Her parents wouldn't have left it with clear instructions unless it was vital. "I'll do what I can," she said. "Now, that's what I like to hear." He pulled back smug. "You wouldn't have found your way to the palace if it weren't for me, so show a little gratitude." "I have to get back to my post," she said. "What do you mean? We only spoke business. Now we can really have some fun." He squeezed her side, his hand sliding upward toward her chest. "Let's go somewhere more private." Over her dead body, she drew a breath to shut him down, but an overwhelming presence pressed in beside them. She turned and found Asher standing there. He cut Devon a sharp, warning look before focusing on her. "The king needs you. Now." Devon dropped his arms from around Lyra and held out a hand to Asher. "Hello, we've met before. I'm Alpha Devon of." Asher turned and walked away, ignoring him. Lyra allowed herself one brief, satisfying glance at Devon's peeved face, then followed Asher. She wasn't thrilled that Julian had summoned her, but anything that got her away from Devon was a blessing at this point. Asher led her out of the banquet hall and up the stairs. He stopped outside Julian's suite. "He's waiting inside." Lyra hesitated. Why was Julian in his rooms when the engagement party was still in full swing? She drew a steadying breath, opened the door, and stepped in. The room was dim, the lights off, the bedside lamp turned low. Julian sat in an armchair near the window, a glass of liquor in his hand. Lyra took a few steps in and stopped, hands clasped in front of her. "I'm here, Your Majesty." He lifted his head. The blonde hair he'd slicked back earlier had fallen across his forehead, shadowing his eyes. Even in the low light, the intensity of his gaze pressed against her skin. "Why are you standing so far away?" he asked. "I don't bite." Lyra took a few steps closer, stopping in front of his chair. "Did you need me for anything?" she asked. Why wasn't he downstairs with Crystal? Why was he drinking? What did he want from her? "Am I bothering you?" he asked. "Do you want to go back to your lover?" Lyra's brows drew together. What was he? Devon? He must have seen them dancing. "I was just being polite," she said. "That's an interesting way to be polite." He set his glass down and stood, letting him grope you and practically take you apart in front of everyone. Did you miss him that much? Lyra clenched her jaw. It had been a while since she'd heard this cruel edge in his voice, but there it was, sharp as their early days. "You misunderstood," she said, "just like I misunderstood the day I found you in bed with another male." His voice dropped, dangerous. "What else have I misunderstood?" He circled her like a predator stalking prey. "That you're a whore who doesn't know how to keep her legs closed." Lyra's nails bit into her palms. "You claimed he was abusive, and the second you see him, you start rubbing against him like some starved slut. Did you even care that your mate was in the same room?" She'd been holding herself back, but a bitter sound slipped free. "What mate? The one whose engagement party to another woman is happening right now." He stopped in front of her, eyes like blades. "Were you trying to get back at me? You and I have nothing to do with each other," she said, steady and firm. "Beyond me being your bodyguard. What I do with myself is none of your business. Just as you marrying another woman is none of mine. Can I go now?" Julian reached out and hauled her in. Rough, air punched from her chest. And then his mouth crashed onto hers. Her arms were trapped between them, useless. He took a hard, bruising kiss, fast and merciless, until she tore in a breath. "What do you think you're doing?" she snapped, breathless. When he pulled back, he gripped her shoulders and shoved her toward the bed. She hit the mattress, and he pinned her there before she could rise. "You're insane," she ground out. "Aren't you supposed to be with your fiancé right now?" Eager to run back to your lover, he spat. One hand locked her shoulder, the other dragged for her waistband. "You are mine." Lyra stared up at him, disbelief curdling into fury. "Fuck you." "Oh, you're about to." Despite her struggling hands, he forced past fabric. "This body is mine," he hissed. "No one touches you but me. You let anyone else near you, and I'll gut him where it hurts." A strangled sound rose in her throat, half scream, half laugh, all horror. How could anyone be this self-centered? She'd thought she'd seen his worst. She'd been wrong. He was out of his mind. He didn't. "Stop. Your body knows who it belongs to," he rasped, breath hot against her skin. "I don't belong to you," she spat. She hated her body. She hated herself. She hated him. She had been delusional to think she could survive 3 years in this palace. She'd imagined he would leave her alone after formalizing his union with Crystal. But here he was, doing this while his engagement party went on below. He had no intention of letting her go. She couldn't live like this. If this was what waited for her, nothing was worth staying. She could make a life outside the palace. It ended only when he was finished taking what he wanted, leaving her pinned beneath the weight of it. When he finally let her hands go and withdrew, silence settled in, the soft rasp of their breathing, the faint clink of glass on wood somewhere behind him, the stale tang of liquor in the dim room. Lyra pulled her clothes together with shaking fingers, stood, and walked out of his suite. As far as Julian was concerned, the engagement ceremony was a failure. He hadn't gotten what he wanted, despite what his guests might think. Instead, annoyingly, he'd ended up with a fiancé that had not been part of his plan. If things had gone his way, Alpha Black would be groveling in the royal dungeon by now, and the entire Blacksword pack would be at Julian's mercy. But Alpha Black was playing his cards close to his chest, careful, precise, not taking a single step that Julian could catch. Did the other male know he was being investigated? Julian had expected the final piece of proof to fall into his hands tonight. It hadn't. Now he stood saying goodbye to important guests, with Crystal glued to his side. A lot was said, he barely heard any of it. Empty praise, inflated flattery, elites vying for favor. Crystal carried the conversations effortlessly. Even if he didn't necessarily want her as his queen, he could admit she'd be good at it. While Crystal and some couple discussed a future hunt, Julian's gaze wandered to Lyra. She was as alert as ever, eyes scanning the thinning crowd. She looked at him then, their eyes met. She didn't look away immediately, and he could swear he saw hurt from across the room. But she glanced off just as casually, as if she felt nothing. She didn't have to show it. He knew how she felt. They were mates after all, connected in ways that couldn't be put into words. She must hate him, but no matter what, he had to do this for the pack. He was the Lycan King. He had to see the bigger picture. Does that have anything to do with why you were burning with jealousy when you saw her with her former mate? His wolf Yuri asked. Julian ground his teeth. Yes, he couldn't stand seeing her close to another male. She belonged to him. Damn it, he frowned as Lyra turned toward the exit. Where was she going? She was supposed to remain in his vicinity at all times. Through the mind link, he asked Asher where she was headed. Moments later, Asher reported that Lyra had gotten permission from the captain of the King's Guard to leave early. Get her back, Julian ordered. He knew how she felt about him right now. Earlier, when she'd left his room, her expression had been inscrutable, frustrating. None of the reactions he expected, just done with him. He wouldn't put it past her to try to leave the palace to get away from him. Even if she was ready to give up everything, he couldn't let her go. She was still his only protection against his curse. A few minutes later, she appeared before him. Did you need me, Your Majesty? You are not allowed to leave my sight tonight, he told her. Something flashed in Lyra's eyes. If they'd been alone, he was certain she would have told him off. Or maybe not. Beneath that spark of defiance, a new iciness lived there, one he'd never seen before. Yes, Your Majesty, she said quietly, stepping to the side. When the last of the important guests had gone, Crystal walked up and looped her arms around his neck, pressing her body to his. I'm so wiped. Want to go to bed. From the corner of his eye, Julian caught Lyra looking. He swallowed and nodded at Crystal. Sure. Crystal leaned in, pressed a kiss to his mouth, then took his hand and led him toward the stairs. Lyra followed a few steps behind. When Julian and Crystal entered his suite, Lyra remained outside the door. Inside, Julian released Crystal's hand and began to undo his tie. Crystal pushed his hands away and started on it herself. The ceremony was so beautiful, she said, fluttering her lashes. Thank you. Why was she thanking him? It had been Thea's work. He couldn't give a rat's ass what went where, or what Crystal liked. For that matter, Crystal slid off his tie and tossed it onto the bed. Then she began unbuttoning his shirt, slow and deliberate. When it hung open, she pressed her palms to his bare chest and kissed his throat. You must be so tired. Let me make you feel better. Her hand drifted down, rubbing him through his pants. An ache flared in his chest, the same one that had hit him last night at Blacksword. He knew its source, Lyra, just outside the door. He couldn't shake the image of her hurt look. Crystal eased him onto the edge of the bed. Then she unzipped her gown and let it fall to the floor. A flimsy pair of panties was all she wore. She gave him a teasing look as she slid them down her thigh. Crystal was a knockout beauty and a body to match. Curves he wanted to get lost in, soft skin he wanted against his, and a heat that felt like heaven. She was his for the taking, and yet he said, "You should go to your room." Crystal hesitated as she stepped out of her panties. What? He flicked his wrist in a dismissive gesture he knew would piss her off. I don't want you tonight. Go. Her mouth fell open in a silent gasp. What? She asked again. Annoyed, he stood and walked to the window. Don't make me repeat myself. Behind him, he heard her wrestling back into her gown. This is unbelievable, she burst out. She strode up to him and planted herself in his line of sight. What is going on with you? I don't want you in my bed, he said flatly. Simple as that. Crystal huffed, her face mottled with anger and humiliation. Do you think I'm some tramp you can have when you want and toss when you're bored? I'm your fiancé. Would you rather I have my guards throw you out? He asked, cold as ice. She hesitated, wise after all. He would do it, and she knew it. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. Is this because of her? That. He hadn't expected her. He asked, genuinely confused. Crystal laughed, dry and sharp. Don't pretend you don't know, she pointed toward the front door. That slave standing out there. Don't think I haven't seen how you look at her. Is she the one you want instead? Julian's jaw hardened. You have no idea what you're talking about. I'm not stupid, Crystal snapped. I won't stand by and let you humiliate me by rutting with some filthy, disgusting slave. If you don't get rid of her, I will. She spun and stormed out. The door slammed. Julian stared after her, a rush of tangled emotions coursing through him. He couldn't say why he'd done that. It wasn't like he hadn't already slept with Crystal. He couldn't afford to anger her while he was still investigating her father. He needed her on his side. Cursing, he raked his fingers through his hair. What did he care that Lyra was outside? It's not like he'd refuse a queen because of her. What the hell was wrong with him? A knock sounded at the door. Who is it? He bit out. He wasn't in the mood to see anyone. It's me. Lyra's voice came from the other side. He crossed the room before he realized he'd moved. He pulled the door open. She stood there, looking up at him with a strange resolve in her blue eyes. I need to talk to you, she said, firm and emotionless. He didn't want to talk. He reached out, grabbed her arm, and drew her inside. The door shut with a thud behind her. He pressed her to the panel and swooped down to kiss her. His body roared with need heat surging, hard and urgent beneath his clothes. He needed her. He couldn't wait. When he pulled back, he cradled her face and searched her eyes. Her composure was gone. Her lips were wet, swollen, parted, her pupils blown wide. He took her hand and brought her to the bed. This time, she didn't argue. Relief and dark satisfaction flooded him as he finally sank into her. Everything felt right, the way she clung to him, the sounds she made. Afterward, he lay beside her, chest heaving. She pushed up and slipped from the bed. As she reached for her pants, he said, "Stay here tonight." She paused and looked at him. A long, impenetrable silence stretched between them. Then she said, I, Lyra Jenkins of the Blue Knight Pack, reject you, Alpha Julian of the Royal Pack, as my mate. Julian pushed up onto his elbows, eyes narrowed in confusion. What? Lyra pulled on her pants without looking at him. I'm rejecting you. I want you to set me free. Julian climbed out of bed to face her. Forget it. I don't accept your rejection. Lyra held his gaze, unflinching. Why not? What exactly do you want from me? You don't want me as your mate, and you're getting mated to someone else. Let me go. He shook his head. You're not going anywhere. Your place is here with me. Lyra wanted to scream. He wasn't making any sense. Did he even hear himself? He didn't want a mate as worthless as her. He'd formalized his engagement to a powerful alpha's daughter only hours ago. So why couldn't he let her go? I don't want to be here, or with you, she said quietly. I reject you as my mate, the same way you've rejected me in 100 ways. Do me a favor, break this bond once and for all, and I'll get out of your life. Who said I want you out of my life? He shot back. Lyra gave a hollow nod. Right. You must think that because I have no backing, no powerful pack, I'll take whatever you throw my way. I didn't come this far to be treated like this. Accept my rejection, or don't, but either way, I'm leaving. You can try, he said, voice low. You can't get away from me. I'm your king, and there's nowhere you can go that I won't find you. You don't have my permission to go anywhere. Don't cross me. What will you do, kill me? She challenged. A bitter smile touched her lips. Go ahead. Death might be a great escape from this bullshit. You are not allowed to die either, he snapped. Did she truly mean it? The thought that she'd welcome death just to be away from him left a sour taste in his mouth. And strangely, it wasn't because her death would take him with her. It was the same ugly pull he felt whenever he pictured anyone or anything hurting her. Then try your best to stop me, she said, reaching for her bra. If you won't accept my rejection, then as long as I'm breathing, I'll be trying to leave you. I'm done with your games. Did Crystal say something to you? Julian asked. Is that why you're doing this? She reached for her shirt. Why am I so clueless and blind I need your fiancé to explain you to me? You must think I have no self-respect. But then again, I'm just some cheap little bitch to you, right? And since you're so hell-bent on keeping me here, what does that say about you? Do you have a weakness for gutter trash? Lyra, maybe it turns you on thinking about me with other males. She cut in. Is that why you called me here after seeing me with Devon? It got you going, and you couldn't wait to take a taste for yourself. His jaw clenched so hard it ached. If you let another male touch you, I'll do whatever the fuck I want, she said, staring him down. As far as I'm concerned, you're no longer my mate. And don't even start. When you took someone else to your bed with me right outside your door, if I see a male I want, I'll do what I want. And there's nothing you can do about it. His blood will be on your hands, he warned. Then we'll see if you can keep up, she said, snapping on her jacket. After all, I'm just a starving, shameless little bitch who can't keep her legs closed. She strode for the door, but he caught her, arms banding around her and hauling her back against his chest. Say what you want, but don't even think of escaping. You are mine. His grip bit into her, his breath harsh against her ear. The threat in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. God, she hated that. She held steady. She wasn't afraid of him. She wasn't a toy he could break and shelve. She would leave no matter what he did. When he let her go, she walked out without a backward glance. Still, she felt his stare searing her back, his anger rolling after her like a breaking tide. Unknown to Lyra, Crystal watched her leave Julian's room. The moment she saw her, Crystal's anger dulled since leaving Julian's sweet, swelled back, hot and choking. The hate she felt for Lyra was so thick, it felt like a physical thing in her throat. When she'd told Julian she would get rid of Lyra, she hadn't thought through the how. Now she knew exactly what she wanted. Lyra out of the palace, never to return. There was only one way to make sure she never showed her face near Julian again. Crystal had warned her. She hadn't listened. Whatever happened now was on her. I can help with that. A soft feminine voice drifted into Crystal's mind. Do as I say, and she'll be gone forever. No one will know you had a hand in it. Crystal pressed a hand to her throat and looked around, spooked by the sudden voice. Who are you? She asked aloud. A friend, the voice purred. We want the same thing. Send her to the location I tell you. She'll die there. Do you want my help? Crystal had no idea who this was or why they were in her head, but they wanted the same thing. So why hesitate? What location? She whispered. The next day, Crystal ordered a servant to pass false information about the Royal Guard's rotation, assigning Lyra to patrol the western border for rogues. The order puzzled Lyra. It wasn't part of her duties as a member of the King's Guard. There were more than enough warriors for patrol. Still, it wasn't hard to believe Julian would do this to punish her for last night. Was he daring her to escape? After confirming the order did come from the king, Lyra geared up and headed for the border. Surprise aside, she was almost glad to be away from the palace, even for a day. Nothing seemed odd as she moved deeper into the forest, farther from the palace walls. It had been a while since the incident with the corrupted wolf. She believed Julian, cruel as he was, wouldn't send her out alone if there had been any recent sightings. But the closer she got to the border, the more the air changed. The atmosphere shifted. Strange, prickling an aura she couldn't quite pinpoint. Her palm slid to the gun at her hip. Suddenly, soft laughter floated through the trees. Lyra went still, eyes raking the shadows. Feminine laughter, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Her first thought which. It wasn't human, it couldn't be a werewolf either. She turned slowly. Sweeping the trees, the laughter swelled. No one appeared. Lyra swallowed hard. She'd walked into a witch's trap. Rogues were one thing. A witch, God forbid there were more, was entirely different. The only sane move was to fall back and report. She pivoted toward the way she'd come. She took one step, only one before the ground. Yawned opened beneath her and swallowed her whole. Lyra yelped as she plunged through the dark, then slammed onto hard ground. Pain shot from her tailbone up her spine, stealing her breath. She hissed and rolled to one side, teeth gritted. Above her, commotion stirred scampering feet. A quick hush. The scrape of something moving. The air smelled of packed earth and old damp, threaded with sweat and fur. She forgot the pain and grabbed her gun. She pushed herself upright and scanned the space. An underground chamber, rough-hewn walls, low ceiling, shadows clinging to every corner. Yet despite the noise, no one stood in sight. She looked up. A wooden trapdoor sealed the hole she'd fallen through. Swallowing, she eased farther into the room, head tilted. There, soft whispering. The faint rush of breath. Someone trying very hard not to be heard. "Who's there?" she called, gun raised and steady. Silence, stretched. Lyra edged toward a narrow passage that tunneled away from the chamber. "Who are you?" a man's voice asked at last. He stepped out of a side passage, eyes flicking to her gun. He stopped short, wary. "What do you want?" "I fell through by accident," she said, measuring him. A woman drifted into view behind him. Then another man, then another and another. In moments, a whole group ringed the chamber, a few clutching crude weapons. "I don't mean any harm." They were werewolves. All right. Rogues by the look of them. Thin, jumpy, starved for sleep. What the hell were they doing underground in the royal forest, hiding out from patrols? "Where did you come from?" the first male asked. "I'm from the palace." A low murmur rippled through the group. "Are you here alone?" he asked. Lyra weighed her answer. They were rogues. She didn't know them, couldn't trust them, but she was in their den alone, and they were scared of something. Best not to look like a threat. "Yes," she said. She scanned the room. "How do I get out of here?" One of the females stepped forward. "You don't want to do that. There's something out there, and you're lucky it didn't get you yet." "What do you mean?" Lyra asked. "There's a monster wolf," the male replied. "Several, actually. They've been showing up around here lately, so we built underground tunnels to stay away from them. It's getting harder to even hunt." "A monster wolf." "Corrupted." "Several." Lyra's mouth went dry. If there were enough to drive rogues underground. This was bad. Very bad. If a corrupted wolf bit a werewolf, they could turn. If those things hit a group this size, it would spread like wildfire. Realizing they weren't wary of her, but of what lurked above, she slowly holstered her gun. "Tell me what you've seen," she said. "The palace has been tracking strange creatures in the forest, but we haven't caught any so far." "Why should we tell her anything?" a younger male snapped. "The palace hunts us too. Take her to the dungeon, and who else do you think can get rid of those monsters?" The female shot back. "If the palace doesn't take care of it, we'll be stuck down here forever. We haven't hunted in 3 days. Can you promise the safety of my pack?" the first male asked. "We only set camp here because we thought the royal forest was safer than anywhere else. We didn't expect they'd be here too. As soon as this problem is gone, we'll leave. If you help us, I can talk to the king," she said. She'd been sent to check on rogues. But this was bigger. Rogues were nothing compared to corrupted wolves. If they had solid intel, Julian would need it. The male nodded. My name is Roger. I'm Lyra. Roger tipped his chin toward the ceiling. How did you find us? I didn't, she said. Your door opened right under me. She remembered that soft laughter before the fall. Witches, rogues, corrupted wolves. A damned party in the forest. What if they find us? The female asked, voice tight. If she did, so can they. It's not safe here anymore. Anxious murmurs rose, heads turning toward the passages. Do you have somewhere else you can take them? Lyra asked Roger. He nodded. Yes, I can show you a safer passage out too, so you can get back. Please send help as soon as you can. We can't survive down here much longer. I will, she promised. The chamber burst into careful motion. The rogues snatched up their few belongings, shouldered packs, checked on elders and children. Roger kept his voice low, reminding them to move silent. Corrupted wolves had sharp senses, even a whisper might carry. We can go now, Roger said, gathering them in the chamber. We'll take the eastern passage. Lyra nodded and stepped forward. The trapdoor above shot open. Something huge and black dropped through. Silence shattered. Another hulking shape plunged after the first, then another, and another. The chamber flooded with corrupted wolves. Run! Lyra shouted at the rogues, yanking her gun free. Roger and several others shifted mid-stride, fur bristling, claws scraping stone. When the corrupted wolves charged, the rogues met them head-on. The scene turned to horror. The monsters ripped through them fast, brutal, relentless, like tigers toying with kittens. Blood hit the air, hot and metallic. Snarls, screams, the wet crunch of bone. Lyra's stomach knotted. If this kept up, the whole pack would be slaughtered. She spun. The non-fighters huddled near the wall, eyes wide, frozen as their warriors fell. She found the female from before. Go, Lyra said. Voice hard, take everyone and go. I'll hold them back. Alone. The woman stuttered. I've got this. If you stay, you'll die. Go now. The female nodded, then hustled the group toward the eastern passage. By some miracle, none of the monsters peeled off to follow. Lyra's gun barked until the chamber echoed empty clicks. She cursed, dropped the magazine, and drew her daggers. A few rogues still fought, then they didn't. Bodies sprawled across the stone, the air thick with iron and fur. Lyra set her feet, jaw clenched. 4 corrupted wolves circled, eyes blazing, black fur slick with blood. She tightened her grip until the hilts bit her palms. No matter what, this would not be the end.